The morning light filtering through the pine trees of Normandy carried an unfamiliar sound on June 7th. 1944. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, crouched behind the stone wall of a collapsed farmhouse, heard it before he saw it, a high-pitched mechanical whine, incongruous among the distant artillery rumble and sporadic rifle fire. Then the American paratrooper appeared, weaving between the hedgerows on what looked like a child's motorized bicycle, a tube-shaped weapon strapped across his back that was nearly as long as the strange little vehicle itself. Hartmann, a veteran of Crete and a decorated officer of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, felt something unfamiliar twist in his stomach. Not fear exactly, but recognition that the rules had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hartmann had jumped from Ju-52 transport aircraft over Crete 3 years earlier, watching his equipment containers tumble separately into the olive groves below, knowing he would land with only his pistol and gravity knife until he could reach those precious canisters containing his rifle and ammunition. It was the price of being Fallschirmjäger, the elite, the first, the airborne pioneers who had shocked the world at Ebony Mile and conquered an entire island from the sky. They had accepted their tactical vulnerability in those crucial minutes after landing because no one else in the world could do what they did. Or so they believed. Now, watching this American casually motor past with what appeared to be a personal anti-tank weapon readily accessible, Hartmann understood with crystalline clarity that the Americans hadn't just copied German airborne doctrine. They had fundamentally reimagined it. Visual cue, split image. German Fallschirmjäger jumping from Ju-52 with minimal equipment versus American paratrooper mid-jump, heavily laden with equipment bags and weapons. The story of how American paratroopers came to jump with folding motorcycles and bazookas is not simply a tale of technological innovation. It is the story of how industrial capacity, creative problem-solving, and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom transformed airborne warfare in ways that shocked even the Germans who had invented it. More profoundly, it reveals the psychological earthquake experienced by German airborne forces who had defined themselves by their elite status and tactical superiority, only to discover that their opponents had leapfrogged them entirely. To understand the depth of this shock, we must first understand what it meant to be Fallschirmjäger in the early years of the war, and why the very idea of jumping with heavy weapons seemed to violate the fundamental physics of airborne operations. In 1940, when German paratroopers descended on the Belgian fortress of Ebene Emael, the war's first combat airborne assault, they represented something entirely new in military history. The 78 men who landed on the fortress roof in DFS 230 gliders weren't just soldiers. They were members of an exclusive brotherhood that combined the selection rigor of special forces with the technical demands of aviation. Of the thousands who volunteered for Fallschirmjäger training, fewer than 1 in 5 completed the program. Those who did earned the right to wear the distinctive eagle and swastika emblem and the Luftwaffe paratrooper smock that marked them as different from ordinary infantry. Visual cue, close-up of Fallschirmjäger insignia, and the distinctive RZ model parachute harness. But this elite status came with severe tactical limitations that were baked into the very technology of German airborne operations. The RZ parachute system used by the Fallschirmjäger was a single-point harness that was attached only at the back of the paratrooper's neck and upper spine. Unlike the later American systems with multiple attachment points distributed across the torso, the RZ design meant that jumpers experienced a violent forward rotation upon exit, often leaving men temporarily stunned upon landing. This was not a design flaw. German engineers had calculated that this system minimized the risk of parachute entanglement from the low jump altitudes used by the Ju-52 transport aircraft, typically between 300 and 400 feet. The consequence of this design choice was absolute. German paratroopers could carry almost nothing on their persons during the jump. The shock of the parachute opening and the violent landing would turn a rifle into a broken bone, a heavy pack into internal injuries. The solution was the Waffenbehälter, cylindrical weapons containers, each about 4 feet long, that were packed with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and ammunition, then pushed out of the aircraft separately from the men. Each container could hold up to 300 pounds of equipment and was painted in different colors to indicate its contents: yellow for ammunition, red for medical supplies, blue for communications equipment. The tactical mathematics were simple and brutal. A German paratrooper touched ground with a pistol, a gravity knife, and perhaps 4 hand grenades. His rifle was somewhere in the drop zone, inside a container that might have landed 50 yards away or 500, that might be immediately accessible or behind enemy lines. For the first 5 to 15 minutes after landing, an eternity in combat, German paratroopers were extraordinarily vulnerable, armed with weapons effective only to about 50 yards while they desperately searched for the colored containers that held their real combat power. This vulnerability was not theoretical. On Crete in May 1941, the largest German airborne operation of the war, Fallschirmjäger units suffered catastrophic casualties in opening hours precisely because of this equipment gap. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, jumping near Chania, landed scattered across the rocky terrain. New Zealand and Greek defenders, who had been alerted to the attack, systematically hunted down paratroopers before they could reach their weapon containers. Of the 600 men in the regiment's first wave, more than 300 were killed or captured within the first hour. Survivors later reported the psychological horror of landing, seeing enemy soldiers approaching and having only a pistol to defend themselves, while their rifles lay in containers 200 yards away across open ground, swept by machine gun fire. Visual cue: reproduction of period photographs showing scattered Waffenbehälter containers in a Cretan olive grove. Oberleutnant Freiherr von der Heide, commander of the 1st Battalion, 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, wrote in his post-battle report, "The separation of the soldier from his primary weapon during the jump and immediate post-landing phase represents the fundamental tactical weakness of airborne operations. We accept this because we have concluded it cannot be avoided without unacceptable risk to the paratrooper during descent and landing." The German military establishment had studied this problem extensively. Engineers examined whether modifications to the RZ harness could allow paratroopers to carry rifles or machine guns during the jump. Every test ended the same way: broken equipment, injured test jumpers, or parachute malfunctions. The physics seemed immutable. The human body, experiencing the opening shock of a parachute deploying at terminal velocity, simply could not safely carry heavy, rigid objects. The Waffenbehälter system, for all its tactical compromises, appeared to be the only viable solution. This technical limitation shaped German airborne doctrine at its deepest level. Fallschirmjäger operations depended on achieving complete surprise, landing in overwhelming numbers at a single point, and seizing objectives in the brief window before defenders could organize a response. The vulnerability period while gathering weapons wasn't a flaw to be fixed, but a reality to be planned around. Speed, aggression, and the psychological shock of troops appearing from the sky were meant to compensate for the initial lack of firepower, and for a time it worked spectacularly. Eben Emael fell in 30 hours. The bridges at Rotterdam and Moerdijk were captured intact. Even on Crete, despite horrific losses, the Fallschirmjäger ultimately prevailed, though at a cost that led Hitler to largely abandon large-scale airborne operations for the remainder of the war. By 1943, when American airborne forces began operating in significant numbers, German paratroopers had settled into a comfortable assumption. They had paid for their expertise with blood, learned the hard lessons, and established the parameters of what was possible in airborne warfare. The Americans and British, they believed, would have to learn the same lessons, accept the same limitations, and develop similar doctrine because the laws of physics applied equally to everyone. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption was. The American approach to airborne warfare began not with doctrine but with a problem and an institutional willingness to challenge accepted limitations. When the U.S. Army established its airborne test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia, in June 1940, the officers assigned to develop American airborne capabilities studied German operations with intense interest. They noted the Waffenbehälter system and the tactical vulnerability it created. But where German engineers had concluded this vulnerability was unavoidable, American developers asked a different question. What if the premise itself was wrong? Lieutenant William T. Ryder, one of the original test platoon officers, later recalled, "We looked at the German system and respected it. They had proven the concept worked in combat, but we also saw men dying because they couldn't shoot back for the first 10 minutes on the ground. That seemed like a problem with a solution, not an immutable law of nature." The solution began with the parachute itself. American engineers developed the T-5 parachute system with multiple risers attaching to a webbing harness distributed across the paratrooper's shoulders, chest, and legs. This distributed the opening shock across a larger portion of the body, reducing the violent rotation that characterized German jumps. More importantly, it meant American paratroopers could potentially carry significantly more weight during the descent. Visual cue. Technical diagram comparing RZ single-point harness with T5 distributed harness system. But carrying capacity alone didn't solve the weapons problem. A standard M1 Garand rifle was 43 inches long and weighed 9.5 pounds. Even with the improved harness, having that rifle strapped to a paratrooper's body during the opening shock risked serious injury. The answer came through innovation in weapons configuration and carrying methods. The M1A1 carbine, adopted in 1941 specifically with airborne troops in mind, was 35 inches long and weighed just over 5 pounds. Crucially, it could be broken down into 2 pieces for the jump and rapidly reassembled upon landing. This meant paratroopers could jump with their primary weapon secured to their body in a padded case, then have a functioning rifle in their hands within 30 seconds of hitting the ground, not 30 minutes. For heavier weapons, American quartermasters developed the Griswold bag and later the leg bag system. These were canvas containers that could hold machine guns, mortars, or ammunition, and were attached to the paratrooper's leg. Just before landing, the jumper would release the bag on a 15-foot rope, allowing it to hit the ground first, and absorbing the impact separately from the paratrooper's body. It wasn't perfect. Leg bags sometimes released prematurely or failed to release at all, leading to hard landings, but it meant that heavier weapons arrived with the soldier, not in a separate container that might be anywhere in the drop zone. Then came the bazooka. The M1A1 rocket launcher, nicknamed the Bazooka, after a comedic musical instrument, represented a genuine revolution in infantry anti-tank capability. Developed in 1942 and refined throughout 43, it fired a 2.36-inch diameter rocket that could penetrate 4 inches of armor at effective ranges up to 300 yards. More revolutionary than its punch, however, was its design. The launcher was a simple tube that could be broken down into 2 sections, each just under 30 inches long, weighing together about 13 pounds including the optical sight. This meant a single paratrooper could jump with a personal anti-tank weapon, assemble it within a minute of landing, and immediately engage enemy armor. No container to find. No waiting for heavy weapons to be distributed from a central supply point. Individual paratroopers became mobile anti-tank teams. The implications were staggering. A company of American paratroopers, roughly 120 men, could jump with 18 to 24 bazookas distributed among its ranks. Within 5 minutes of landing, that company could establish an anti-tank perimeter that would require a German infantry battalion multiple hours to achieve. Assuming their Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck weapons had survived the drop and been successfully distributed from containers. But the innovation that perhaps most vividly demonstrated American willingness to reimagine airborne warfare was the Wellbike. The Wellbike was born from a simple observation. Paratroopers who landed scattered across a drop zone wasted precious time walking to their objectives. In conventional infantry operations, this wasn't critical. Units expected to take hours or days moving to contact. But airborne operations depended on speed and concentration of force. Every minute spent hiking to the rally point was a minute the enemy had to organize defenses. British engineers at the Special Operations Executive initially developed the concept in 1942, a folding motorcycle compact enough to fit in a standard parachute container, light enough for one man to handle, yet capable of carrying a soldier and his equipment at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. The Wellbike Mark II, which entered production in 1943, was an engineering marvel of purposeful minimalism. Fully assembled, it was 52 inches long with a wheelbase of just under 36 inches. The single-cylinder Villiers 98 cubic centimeter two-stroke engine produced about 1 horsepower, barely enough to power a modern lawnmower. But the entire machine weighed only 71 pounds. Most remarkably, it could be folded into a package just 15 inches tall, small enough to fit in a cylindrical container that could be strapped under an aircraft or dropped separately with a dedicated parachute. Visual cue: sequential photographs showing Wellbike folding process and parachute container deployment. The Americans, observing British trials, immediately grasped the tactical potential. The Airborne Command requisitioned hundreds of Wellbikes throughout 1943 and early 44, distributing them to reconnaissance platoons and headquarters elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The official designation was motorcycle parachutists, but soldiers quickly dubbed them paramotos, or simply the little bikes. The tactical doctrine was straightforward. Drop the Wellbikes in dedicated containers near the planned drop zones. Have designated soldiers retrieve and assemble them within minutes of landing, then use them to rapidly establish communications between scattered units, conduct reconnaissance, and transport officers to rally points. What took a platoon 45 minutes to walk could be accomplished by a soldier on a Wellbike in 7 minutes. When combined with the bazooka, the tactical picture became truly revolutionary. A 2-man team, one driving the Wellbike, one riding pillion with a bazooka, could provide mobile anti-tank capability that could reposition across a drop zone faster than any armored vehicle could respond. These teams could establish a hasty anti-tank ambushes along approach routes, delay enemy armor advancing toward landing zones, and then rapidly displace before infantry could be brought forward to eliminate them. The Germans had nothing comparable, not because they lacked engineering capability, but because they had never questioned the fundamental premise that paratroopers must accept extreme tactical limitations during and immediately after the jump. The Waffenbehelter system had worked in Poland, in Norway, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and ultimately, at horrific cost, on Crete. Why would they imagine an entirely different approach? Oberst Bruno Breuer, commander of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Regiment, had written in a doctrine manual circulated in 1942 The airborne soldier's advantage is not in his armament, but in his sudden appearance and the moral effect of troops from the sky. Once the enemy recovers from this shock, the airborne soldier fights as standard infantry. The gap between landing and full combat capability must be minimized through speed and aggression, but it cannot be eliminated. This wasn't defeatism. It was the distilled wisdom of men who had jumped into combat and survived. It represented the best thinking of the world's most experienced airborne force, and it was about to become catastrophically obsolete. The first large-scale American airborne operations in Europe came in Sicily in July 1943, and then in Italy later that year. These operations were chaotic, with units scattered over dozens of square miles, many aircraft shot down by friendly fire, and objectives taken through desperate improvisation rather than according to plan. German after-action reports from these engagements noted American tactical confusion, but also observed something unexpected. Even scattered American paratroopers seemed better armed than concentrated German units would have been in similar circumstances. A captured intelligence summary from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, engaged against American paratroopers near Gela, Sicily, noted with puzzlement. Enemy airborne infantry encountered on 13 July possessed anti-tank weapons in numbers disproportionate to their unit size. One enemy squad of approximately 8 men destroyed 2 Panzer IV tanks with unidentified tube-launched projectile weapons before being eliminated. Traditional doctrine suggests such heavy weapons would not be immediately available to scattered airborne forces. The unidentified tube-launched projectile weapons were bazookas, carried and operated by individual paratroopers who had landed with them strapped to their legs or backs. But it was in Normandy in June 1944 that German paratroopers came face to face with the full scope of American airborne innovation, and where officers like Klaus Hartmann experienced their moment of shocked realization. The Allied invasion plan for D-Day called for massive airborne operations to secure the flanks of the beach landings. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop behind Utah Beach to secure causeways and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. The British 6th Airborne Division would secure the eastern flank near Caen. These were not small raids. Over 13,000 American paratroopers would jump in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944. Visual cue, map of Normandy showing drop zones for 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, with overlays indicating German defensive positions. Among the German units positioned to respond to any invasion was the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, now rebuilt after its mauling on Crete, and stationed near Saint-Lô, roughly 20 miles from the coast. These were not the same men who had jumped over Maleme airfield 3 years earlier. Most of those veterans were dead or scattered across other units. But they carried the same traditions, wore the same insignia, and believed themselves to be qualitatively superior to any other infantry, airborne or otherwise. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, now 28 years old, commanded the regiment's reconnaissance company. He had survived Crete by reaching his weapon container faster than most, and by possessing the ruthless decisiveness that characterized Fallschirmjäger leadership. He had earned the Iron Cross First Class in the brutal house-to-house, fighting in Chania, and had been promoted twice. He knew airborne warfare in his bones, its possibilities, and, more importantly, its limitations. On the morning of June 6th, when reports began filtering in of massive airborne landings along the coast, Hartmann's regiment received orders to move north and engage the American paratroopers before they could consolidate. The regiment's commander, Oberst Robert Freiherr von der Heide, the same officer who had written so eloquently about the Waffenbehälter's tactical limitations, briefed his officers with cool professionalism. The Americans have jumped scattered, as all paratroopers do. von der Heide explained, pointing to map coordinates that showed reported landing areas spread over nearly 50 square miles. They will be disorganized, attempting to locate weapon containers, establish communications, and identify their positions. We will advance rapidly, locate their assembly areas before they can concentrate, and destroy them in detail. They are airborne infantry, like us. They will fight well once organized, but we will not give them that time. It was sound doctrine, based on extensive experience and thorough understanding of airborne operations' inherent vulnerabilities. Von der Heide had fought British paratroopers in North Africa and had studied reports from Sicily. He knew his enemy was brave and well-trained. He also knew that for at least the first hour after landing they would be at their weakest. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment moved north in the afternoon of June 6th, advancing through the distinctive bocage terrain of Normandy, small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows, creating natural defensive positions every 100 yards. It was a terrible country for offensive operations, but ideal for delaying actions by dispersed light infantry, which was exactly what the American paratroopers were conducting. Hartmann's reconnaissance company, ranging ahead of the main regiment, made first contact near the village of Grange shortly after dawn on June 7th. His lead squad reported enemy contact. A small group of American paratroopers, perhaps 10 to 12 men, occupying a farmhouse complex overlooking the main road. Standard procedure would be to fix them in place, bring up mortars and machine guns, then assault with superior numbers. But before Hartmann could organize the attack, something unexpected happened. One of the Americans mounted what appeared to be a small motorcycle that had been concealed in the farm's courtyard. The soldier, Hartmann, could see through his binoculars that he wore the distinctive American paratrooper uniform with its cargo pockets and webbing harness, started the little machine with a few kicks, and began driving directly toward the German position, weaving between the hedgerows at surprising speed. Hartmann's first thought was that the American was attempting a suicide run, or had panicked. Then he saw the second American on the back of the motorcycle, holding a long tube across his lap. The bike stopped abruptly about 200 yards away, partially concealed by a hedgerow. The passenger dismounted, assembled something from 2 pieces he'd been carrying, and took a kneeling position. "That's a Panzerschreck," one of Hartmann's sergeants muttered, recognizing the general shape of an anti-tank weapon. "But how did they just landed yesterday. Their heavy weapons should still be scattered." The American fired. The rocket left a distinctive smoke trail, and one of the regiment's few remaining armored cars, a Stugkafzes 232 providing support to Hartmann's company, exploded as the warhead penetrated its thin armor and detonated the fuel tank inside. Before Hartmann could process what had happened, the 2 Americans were back on the motorcycle, accelerating away through a gap in the hedgerows, disappearing in seconds. Visual cue, period-accurate illustration of 2 American paratroopers on a well bike, one driving, one with an assembled bazooka across his lap. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. 2 soldiers on a vehicle barely larger than a bicycle had destroyed an armored car and escaped before infantry could be maneuvered to engage them. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Airborne troops didn't have mobile anti-tank capability. They couldn't have motorcycles. Motorcycles were heavy, bulky equipment that required support vehicles to transport, and they certainly couldn't have both within 24 hours of landing by parachute. But Hartmann had just watched it happen. Over the next 3 days, as the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment attempted to push toward the coast, Hartmann's understanding of airborne warfare underwent a fundamental revision. The Americans weren't simply brave or well-trained. They were operating under entirely different tactical rules. His reconnaissance patrols reported American paratroopers scattered across the countryside in small groups, consistently armed with anti-tank weapons far heavier than anything German paratroopers would have carried on their persons. Where German doctrine called for consolidating strength before engaging enemy armor, individual American squads, 8 to 12 men, engaged and destroyed German vehicles with shoulder-fired rockets, then dispersed before retaliatory fire could be organized. The Welbikes appeared repeatedly. American officers used them to move between scattered units, establishing communications and coordinating defenses far faster than should have been possible given the chaos of the drop. Reconnaissance teams on the little motorcycles appeared unexpectedly, observed German movements, and disappeared before they could be engaged. Several times, German units advancing down roads were ambushed by American paratroopers who had used Welbikes to rapidly position blocking forces, then escaped on the same vehicles after inflicting casualties.
You find this story engaging? Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical mathematics that had governed airborne warfare since Crete were simply no longer valid. Hartman found himself constantly recalculating what should have been straightforward problems. A scattered American company should have required 2 to 3 hours to consolidate and establish effective defensive positions. Instead, they were organized and fighting effectively within 30 minutes. American paratroopers cut off from their units should have been vulnerable, armed only with personal weapons. Instead, they possessed squad-level anti-tank capability that forced German forces to treat every hedgerow as a potential anti-armor ambush. On June 9th, Hartman's company encountered something that crystallized the entire experience into a single, unforgettable image. Advancing through a sunken lane between high hedgerows near the town of Carentan, his lead element came under fire from American paratroopers, occupying positions in a stone farmhouse about 300 yards ahead. The engagement developed into a standard infantry firefight. Rifle and machine gun fire exchanged while both sides maneuvered for advantage. Hartman organized his company for an assault, bringing up 2 machine gun teams to provide covering fire, while his assault squads worked around the American flanks. Then, from a concealed position in the hedgerow to the left of the farmhouse, an American paratrooper emerged riding one of the small motorcycles. Strapped to the bike's rudimentary cargo rack was what appeared to be a significant load of ammunition crates. The soldier drove directly toward the farmhouse under fire. Hartman's men were shooting at him. He could see bullets kicking up dirt around the bike. But the American kept going, hunched low over the handlebars, using the motorcycle's speed and maneuverability to make himself a nearly impossible target. He reached the farmhouse, dumped the ammunition crates through a window, turned the bike around and accelerated back the way he'd come, disappearing into the hedgerows before Hartman could organize concentrated fire on his escape route. It was such a simple thing, a resupply run that took perhaps 45 seconds. But it represented capabilities that violated everything Hartman thought he knew about airborne operations. The motorcycle itself, compact enough to be hidden in a normal hedgerow. The tactical decision to use it for resupply under fire rather than hoarding it for command and control. The casual acceptance of risk that came from knowing that even if the bike was destroyed, the mission could continue because individual soldiers already possessed the weapons they needed. Visual cue. Scene recreation of Welbike resupply run through Norman hedgerows under fire. That evening, after his company had withdrawn from the engagement without taking the farmhouse the American paratroopers had held despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1, Hartman sat with his executive officer, Lieutenant Werner Schultz, examining a captured American equipment manual they had found in an abandoned drop zone. The manual, soaked from 2 days in wet grass but still partially legible, detailed equipment loads for American airborne infantry.
Schultz, who spoke reasonable English, translated the relevant sections. Each American paratrooper jumped with an average combat load of between 100 and 120 pounds, not including the parachute itself. Rifle squads had designated bazooka teams, 2 men per squad carrying the launcher and rockets in padded leg bags. Machine gun crews jumped with the M19-19-4 Browning already broken down and distributed among team members, ready to be reassembled and fired within 2 minutes of landing. The manual included deployment procedures for the motorcycle, parachutists, describing how the well-bike containers were to be dropped with dedicated parachutes and recovered by designated personnel within 15 minutes of landing. Expected assembly time, 3 to 5 minutes. Range on internal fuel, approximately 90 miles. Schultz looked up from the manual with an expression Hartman had never seen on his face before, something between professional admiration and existential worry. "Sir, they've solved it," Schultz said quietly. "The fundamental problem of airborne warfare. The vulnerability gap between landing and full combat effectiveness. They haven't minimized it. They've eliminated it." Hartman didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about Crete, about running across that olive grove with only his pistol, while Greek soldiers fired at him from 200 yards away, about watching friends die because they couldn't reach their weapon containers. He was thinking about 3 years of accepting that vulnerability as the price of being Fallschirmjäger, of building doctrine and tactics around an assumed limitation. "We invented this," he finally said, gesturing vaguely at the sky, meaning airborne warfare itself. "We proved it could be done. We wrote the manual." "They read our manual," Schultz replied, "and wrote a better one." The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment continued fighting in Normandy through June and into July, increasingly committed to defensive operations as the Allied breakout developed. They fought well. Fallschirmjäger remained elite infantry regardless of how they arrived on the battlefield, but the psychological edge had shifted. They were no longer the most advanced airborne force in the world. They weren't even the most advanced airborne force in Normandy. For Hartman personally, the transformation in understanding came gradually, through accumulated experiences rather than a single revelatory moment. Each encounter with American paratroopers reinforced the same lesson. Industrial capacity mattered, innovation mattered, and willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions mattered more than tradition or historical precedent. On June 23rd, his company captured several American paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. During the processing of prisoners, Hartman, who spoke competent English, learned during 2 years studying engineering in London before the war, questioned them about their equipment and training. One of the prisoners, a corporal from Ohio named Michael Morrison, was remarkably forthcoming, perhaps because he was exhausted, perhaps because he didn't think equipment information was particularly sensitive. "The bazooka," Morrison said when Hartman asked about the anti-tank weapon. "We've been training with those since early '43. Every rifle squad has at least one team. We qualified with them just like we qualified with rifles. Jump with them, land, assemble, shoot, standard procedure." "And the motorcycles?" Hartman pressed. Morrison actually smiled at that. "The well bikes? Those are mostly for scouts and officers, but yeah, we dropped with about 30 of them in the battalion. Little bastards are hard to start when they're wet, but once you get them running, they're fantastic. Beat the hell out of walking." "How much do you carry when you jump?" Hartman asked, genuinely curious. Morrison thought for a moment. "Depends on your job. Basic rifleman, maybe 90 to 100 pounds of gear plus the parachute. I was a bazooka gunner, So I had the launcher sections, 6 rockets in my leg bag, rifle, ammunition, rations, an entrenching tool, a gas mask we never used, and a first aid kit, probably closer to 120 pounds total. 120 pounds. The maximum German paratroopers could safely carry was perhaps 40 pounds, and that was pushing the limits of the RZ harness. The Americans were jumping with 3 times the combat load, landing with their primary weapons immediately accessible, and organizing for combat in minutes rather than hours. Visual cue. Side-by-side comparison illustration of German Fallschirmjäger. Minimal jump loadout versus American paratrooper full combat load with labeled equipment. "Your parachutes are better than ours?" Hartman asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Morrison shrugged. "I don't know. Never jumped with yours. Ours work fine. The T5 is pretty reliable. We lose maybe 1 in 1,000 to malfunctions, and we've got reserves that deploy automatically if the main fails." Automatic reserve parachutes. Multiple point harnesses allowing heavy loads. Weapons designed specifically for airborne use. Vehicles that could be parachuted and assembled in minutes. The Americans hadn't just copied German airborne doctrine. They had systematically identified every limitation, every compromise, every accepted weakness, and engineered solutions. That evening, Hartman wrote a letter to his younger brother Hans, who was training with a Fallschirmjäger replacement battalion in Germany. The letter was never delivered. It was among Hartman's personal effects when he was captured in August, but it survived in military archives and provides a remarkably candid assessment from a combat veteran coming to terms with technological obsolescence. "We are no longer the elite," Hartman wrote. "Or rather, we are elite in spirit and training, but we fight with doctrine and equipment designed for a different war. The American paratroopers I have encountered are not supermen. They make mistakes. They can be outfought on equal terms. They die like anyone when properly engaged. But they are never on equal terms. They land with advantages we do not possess and cannot replicate. They have solved problems we accepted as unsolvable. I watched one of their men destroy an armored car with a weapon he carried on his back during a parachute jump. I saw another deliver ammunition to surrounded troops using a motorcycle that had been dropped from an aircraft. These are not extraordinary events for them. They are normal, expected capabilities. We praised ourselves for accepting limitations and fighting despite them. They refused to accept limitations and invented ways around them. If you still intend to join the Fallschirmjäger, be proud of the history and the tradition, but understand that the Americans have written the next chapter of that history, and we are no longer writing it. The technical specifications behind American airborne innovation were, in retrospect, not particularly mysterious. The T5 parachute system was well documented. Its advantages over the RZ design clearly understood by anyone who studied engineering. The M1A1 bazooka was effective but not revolutionary in its basic concept. The Germans had developed similar weapons like the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust. Even the Wellbike, for all its clever engineering, was fundamentally just a very small motorcycle with a folding frame. What separated American airborne capabilities from German wasn't any single piece of equipment, but rather the systematic approach to solving interconnected problems. The better parachute harness enabled heavier loads. Heavier loads made specialized airborne weapons worthwhile. Specialized weapons changed tactical doctrine. Changed doctrine revealed new problems like communications and mobility, which drove innovations like the Wellbike. Each solution created space for the next innovation. Equally important was industrial capacity. the United States produced approximately 2.36 million M1A1 bazookas during the war. German production of equivalent weapons never exceeded 500,000 units of all types combined. American factories built roughly 3,800 well bikes for military use, a relatively modest number but sufficient to equip reconnaissance elements of airborne divisions, according to established tables of organization. Germany never attempted motorized equipment specifically designed for airborne operations because their industrial priorities lay elsewhere. The Germans could have built well bikes. They could have developed distributed load parachute harnesses. They could have designed compact anti-tank weapons for airborne use. What they couldn't do was build these things in sufficient quantities while simultaneously maintaining production of conventional weapons, while replacing combat losses, while their factories were being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. By late 1944, this reality had become crushingly apparent to German airborne forces. The Fallschirmjäger divisions that fought in Normandy, and later in Holland during Operation Market Garden, and finally in the desperate defensive battles in Germany itself, were Fallschirmjäger in name and spirit only. Most had never made a combat jump. They were elite infantry trained to standards higher than regular units. But they fought as ground troops, their parachutes and distinctive smocks relegated to ceremonial purposes. The last major German airborne operation of the war came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge, when Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, a cousin of Robert von der Heydte who had commanded the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, led approximately 1,200 paratroopers in Operation Stösser, a jump near Malmedy designed to disrupt American communications and seize a critical road junction. The operation was a comprehensive failure. Fewer than 300 of the paratroopers landed within 10 miles of the designated drop zone. Von der Heydte assembled about 100 men, attempted to accomplish his mission without heavy weapons or communications equipment, most of which had scattered across the Belgian countryside in the chaotic drop, and ultimately surrendered after 5 days of ineffective operations. In his post-war debriefing, von der Heydte was asked why the operation had failed so completely. His answer was blunt. We attempted a mission that required 1940 capabilities with 1944 resources and doctrine. The Americans have been making combat jumps regularly for 18 months, perfecting their equipment and procedures. We had not conducted a division-level airborne operation since Crete. We were attempting to replicate success from 4 years earlier without recognizing that the standard for airborne warfare had advanced beyond our capabilities. Visual cue. Contrast image. American paratroopers in Operation Market Garden with full equipment loads versus scattered German Fallschirmjäger in Operation Stösser, searching for weapon containers. For individual Fallschirmjäger like Klaus Hartmann, the psychological adjustment was perhaps more difficult than the tactical one. There is a particular pain in watching others master and surpass a craft.
You pioneered. The Fallschirmjäger had defined themselves by their exceptional capabilities, by their willingness to accept extraordinary risks, by their status as the world's premier airborne force. That identity couldn't survive contact with opponents who demonstrated superior capabilities derived from better equipment and doctrine. Hartmann survived the Normandy campaign and fought in Holland during Market Garden, where he encountered British airborne forces at Arnhem. He was captured in early 1945 during the defense of the Rhine and spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in England. His interrogation records, preserved in British archives, include an extended discussion about German airborne doctrine and his observations of Allied airborne forces. The interrogating officer, a British captain named James Thornton, who had himself served with the 1st Airborne Division, asked Hartmann what he thought was the most significant difference between German and Allied airborne forces. Hartmann's answer,
Transcribed verbatim in the interrogation report was, "You were willing to question whether things had to be the way they were. We accepted limitations as facts. You treated limitations as problems to be solved. In the end, that difference mattered more than courage or training or tradition." Thornton pressed him. "But you invented airborne warfare. Eben Emael, Crete, those were your victories. You proved the concept." "We proved it could be done," Hartman replied. "You proved it could be done well." The bazooka itself, the weapon that had shocked German observers with its presence in the hands of individual paratroopers, had a development history that perfectly illustrated the American approach to military innovation. The story begins not with generals or defense contractors, but with a junior officer and a civilian scientist who saw a problem and refused to accept that existing solutions were adequate. In the spring of 1942, the United States Army faced a crisis in anti-tank capability. German panzer divisions were systematically destroying Allied armor in North Africa. The standard American anti-tank weapon, the 37mm gun, could barely scratch the frontal armor of a Panzer IV, much less the new Tiger tanks beginning to appear on the battlefield. Infantry needed something portable, effective, and simple enough for soldiers to use without extensive technical training. Captain Leslie Skinner, an ordnance officer, and Dr. Clarence Hickman, a physicist who had worked on rocket development during the First World War, believed shaped charge warheads launched from a simple tube could provide the answer. The concept wasn't new. The physics of shaped charges had been understood since the 1880s, but making it practical required solving problems of rocket propulsion, stability, and launcher design. Working at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Skinner and Hickman developed a IE prototype in a matter of weeks. The launcher was literally a length of steel pipe with a simple wooden stock, a rudimentary sight, and electrical connections to ignite the rocket motor. The rocket itself was 2.36 inches in diameter, chosen because that size allowed sufficient explosive payload while keeping the weapon man-portable, with folding fins that deployed after launch to stabilize flight. The first test firing took place in late May 1942. The rocket traveled 200 yards, struck a tank hull, and penetrated 3 inches of armor plate. Within days, demonstration firings were conducted for Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. The general watched a soldier fire the weapon 3 times in rapid succession, hitting a moving target at 150 yards with each shot. Marshall immediately ordered the weapon into production, bypassing the normal years-long procurement process. Visual cue, technical cutaway diagram of M1A1 bazooka, showing rocket propellant, shaped charge warhead, and electrical firing mechanism. By November 1942, the first production bazookas were being delivered to units. By mid-1943, they were standard equipment throughout the Army, including airborne divisions. The speed of development and deployment, from concept to combat in less than a year, would have been impossible in the German military-industrial system, where weapons development involved multiple layers of bureaucratic approval and testing protocols that typically required 3 to 5 years. But having the weapon was only half the solution. Making it practical for airborne use required additional innovation. A standard bazooka was 54 inches long, far too awkward to jump with even in the improved American harness system. The answer was elegant. Design the launcher in 2 sections that could be quickly coupled together with a threaded collar. Each section was 27 inches long, easily strapped to a paratrooper's leg or back. Upon landing, the 2 sections could be assembled in approximately 15 seconds by anyone who had practiced the procedure. The rockets themselves presented a different challenge. Each M6A1 anti-tank rocket weighed 3.5 pounds and was 21 inches long. Dropping them loose in an equipment bag risked damaging the fragile fins or denting the body tube, which could cause flight instability. The solution was the M6 rocket bag, a padded canvas carrier that held 6 rockets in individual sleeves, protecting them during the jump and landing while keeping them immediately accessible. American Airborne doctrine called for each rifle squad to include a 2-man bazooka team. The gunner carried the launcher sections and 3 rockets. The assistant gunner carried 6 additional rockets and served as loader and spotter. This meant a 9-man rifle squad had organic anti-tank capability that could engage enemy armor at ranges up to 300 yards. A 40-man platoon had 4 bazooka teams. A 150-man company had 12 teams. A full battalion could bring over 50 bazookas into action within minutes of landing. The tactical implications were profound. German armored doctrine assumed that isolated infantry without heavy weapons were essentially helpless against tanks. Panzers could be used aggressively to overrun scattered infantry positions because the infantry couldn't effectively fight back. This assumption had been valid for the entire war up to that point. Infantry without anti-tank guns or mines were indeed vulnerable to armor. American paratroopers landing in Normandy destroyed that assumption. Individual squads became anti-tank obstacles. Small groups could establish hasty ambush positions along roads, disable lead vehicles, and create bottlenecks that delayed entire columns. The psychological effect on German armor crews was significant. Any hedgerow might conceal a soldier with a weapon that could penetrate their armor, which made aggressive maneuver far more dangerous. The effectiveness of the bazooka in airborne operations during Normandy was documented extensively in after-action reports. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division reported destroying or disabling 23 German armored vehicles in the first 72 hours after landing, with 18 of those kills attributed to bazookas. The regiment had landed scattered across a 30-square-mile area, never fully consolidated during that period, yet still maintained effective anti-tank capability throughout its zone of operations. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division reported similar results. In one notable engagement on June 7th near Sainte-Mère-Église, a single platoon, approximately 35 men who had managed to assemble at a rally point, held a road junction against repeated attacks by elements of the 91st Air Landing Division, a German infantry division attempting to reach the beaches. The platoon's 4 bazooka teams disabled 2 armored cars and 3 half-tracks, forcing the German forces to deploy an attack on foot, which delayed their advance by over 6 hours until American reinforcements arrived from the beaches. These were not exceptional or unusual engagements. They were typical of how American airborne forces operated throughout Normandy. The bazooka had become so fundamental to airborne doctrine that soldiers couldn't imagine conducting operations without it, like asking infantry to fight without rifles. Technical specifications drove tactical doctrine, which in turn drove training and organizational structure. American paratroopers practiced bazooka assembly and firing until it became automatic, muscle memory that functioned under stress. The airborne school at Fort Benning included dedicated bazooka training, with students required to demonstrate proficiency in assembly, loading, and engagement of moving targets before graduation. This wasn't specialized training for selected personnel. It was basic qualification for all airborne infantry. The contrast with German Fallschirmjäger couldn't have been sharper. German paratroopers received basic familiarization with anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, but these weapons were not personally issued during jumps. They remained in the Waffenbehälter system, to be distributed after landing when and if the containers could be located and secured. A German paratrooper might go through his entire career without ever jumping with an anti-tank weapon
immediately accessible on his person. This wasn't because German soldiers were less capable or less brave. It was because the technological foundation of their airborne system, the RZ parachute harness and the doctrine built around its limitations, created a ceiling on what was possible. They could train soldiers to higher standards, instill superior motivation, develop better small unit tactics, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental constraint that their paratroopers landed with minimal equipment and required time to achieve full combat capability. The Welbike, while less militarily significant than the bazooka, perhaps better symbolized the philosophical difference between American and German approaches to airborne warfare. The bazooka solved a critical tactical problem: how to give dispersed paratroopers effective anti-tank capability. The Welbike solved a problem that many didn't recognize as solvable: how to provide mobility to paratroopers who had just landed. Visual cue: period photograph of American paratrooper demonstrating Welbike assembly sequence from container to operational motorcycle. The British had developed the Welbike for their Special Operations Executive, agents parachuting into occupied Europe who needed transportation that could be hidden in a standard supplies container. The motorcycle's design specifications flowed directly from parachute container dimensions. It had to fold to fit in a cylinder no more than 15 inches in diameter and 60 inches long. Weight had to be under 80 pounds, so a single operative could handle it. It needed to be simple enough to assemble without tools by someone who might be working alone in darkness behind enemy lines. Station 9, the SOE facility responsible for developing covert equipment, produced the Welbike through a process that would have horrified conventional military procurement officers. There were no lengthy requirements documents, no competitive bidding processes, no years of testing and evaluation. Engineer Harry Lester designed the concept, built a prototype, tested it personally by riding it around the facility grounds, made modifications based on his observations, and delivered working motorcycles to SOE agents within months. American airborne planners saw immediate tactical applications beyond covert operations. The same characteristics that made the Welbike useful for spies made it valuable for paratroopers: compact, lightweight, simple, and effective. The Airborne Command purchased the British design, ordered production through American manufacturers, and began integrating the motorcycles into airborne operations doctrine. The tactical employment of Welbikes in Normandy validated the concept. Reconnaissance platoons used them to rapidly scout terrain and locate enemy positions. Officers used them to move between dispersed units, establishing command and control far faster than would have been possible on foot. Supply sergeants used them to shuttle critical items, ammunition, medical supplies, radio batteries, between positions. The motorcycles weren't combat vehicles in any traditional sense, but they multiplied the effectiveness of airborne forces by solving the mobility problem that had always plagued dispersed operations. German after-action reports from Normandy repeatedly mentioned the Welbikes with a mixture of surprise and grudging admiration. A report from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, engaged against the 82nd Airborne Division near Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, noted, "Enemy demonstrates unexpected mobility for infantry operating without vehicular support. Small motorized bicycles were observed carrying personnel and light equipment between positions at speeds exceeding 30 kilometers per hour. Origin of these vehicles unclear, not present in captured equipment lists from Sicily or Italy operations. Possibility they were delivered by parachute seems improbable but cannot be otherwise explained." The report's author couldn't quite believe that functional motorcycles had been parachuted into Normandy because the idea seemed absurd according to conventional military logic. Motorcycles required maintenance, fuel, and relatively smooth terrain. Normandy's bocage country was terrible for vehicles.
Yet the Americans had done it anyway because the tactical advantages outweighed the apparent impracticality. This willingness to attempt seemingly impractical solutions characterized the entire American approach to airborne warfare. The T-5 parachute harness, with its multiple attachment points, looked over-engineered compared to the elegant simplicity of the German single-point RZ system, until you needed to carry 100 pounds of equipment. The Bazooka's two-piece construction seemed like an unnecessary complication until you had to jump with it. The Wellbike looked like a toy until you needed to cover 3 miles of enemy territory in 10 minutes. Each innovation addressed a specific problem, but collectively they created a system where the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Better parachutes enabled heavier loads. Heavier loads made specialized weapons practical. Specialized weapons changed tactics. Changed tactics revealed new problems. New problems drove innovation.
The cycle fed on itself, creating continuous improvement. The Germans, by contrast, had optimized their airborne system around accepted constraints. The RZ harness was actually excellent for its intended purpose, minimizing parachute malfunctions at low altitude. The Waffenbehälter system efficiently delivered heavy weapons to the drop zone. Fallschirmjäger training and selection produced exceptionally motivated soldiers. Within the parameters of their system, the Germans had achieved near perfection. But perfecting a system built on limiting assumptions couldn't compete with reimagining the system entirely. The Americans had asked fundamentally different questions. Not, how can we make the best possible system given these constraints? But rather, why do we accept these constraints at all? By the autumn of 1944, when Allied airborne forces jumped into Holland during Operation Market Garden, the capability gap had widened to the point where German and Allied airborne forces were barely comparable. American and British paratroopers landed with individual combat loads exceeding 150 pounds, including personal weapons, crew-served weapons broken down among team members, anti-tank weapons, demolitions, radios, and sufficient ammunition and supplies for 72 hours of sustained operations. German Fallschirmjäger, in the few instances where they still conducted actual airborne operations, jumped with loads under 50 pounds and required immediate access to supply containers to achieve basic combat effectiveness. More often, Fallschirmjäger divisions fought as elite ground infantry, their airborne capabilities theoretical rather than practical. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided a final stark illustration of this divergence. Operation Stüsser, the German airborne component of the offensive, involved approximately 1,200 paratroopers jumping at night to seize road junctions and disrupt American communications. The operation failed catastrophically. Most jumpers landed miles from their objectives. Equipment containers were scattered and lost, and the assembled force accomplished nothing of tactical significance before surrendering or being destroyed. Just 6 months earlier, American and British airborne divisions had executed Market Garden, an operation involving over 35,000 paratroopers and glider infantry landing simultaneously across multiple objectives in Holland. Market Garden ultimately failed at its strategic objectives, but the airborne forces performed their tactical missions effectively, seizing bridges and holding them against superior German forces for days. The failure came from ground forces not advancing quickly enough, not from any fundamental failure of airborne capability. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.